Okay, we should be live. Weird, I got a piece of pizza stuck in my teeth. That's going to look great on camera.
Right, it will. Yep.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Jess! Long time no see. How you doing? Good, good. All right. Welcome, everybody. We've got a huge group today. It's good to see everybody. Welcome to the Salt Lake Azure Group. We're going to talk about Azure databases today. So the last few weeks, I just want to make a little side note. Last few weeks, I've been studying AWS. I like Azure a lot better still, just so you know. But so today we're going to talk about Azure. I'm thinking in the future we may actually shift a little bit and still focus on Azure, but maybe touch on some of the other cloud platforms as well, just to kind of compare and contrast. But we'll see how that goes in the future. I'll talk to my my assistant, my co-organizer here, and we'll decide how we want to go with that. So today we're going to talk about the databases, and in Azure there's a ton of different database options, and we're going to chat about what some of those are. But first, I'm going to show you an agenda. Maybe. Okay, oh, there's an agenda. You know, I really like the design AI feature in PowerPoint. If I didn't have the design AI feature, all my slides would just be a black header with black text. This may not look great, but it looks better than a black header with black text. So this is going to be our agenda. So we started at 1800. So we're going to do welcome, which is what we're doing right now, till 1804, and we're going to stay on this very strictly. So I may cut off in the middle of a sentence to make sure we don't pass this. But then we're going to do some lightning talks. We'll get to the meat of the presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A and discussions, and then the long drive home, and however that takes you, I don't know. It's going to take me a while, and Dallin too. Yep. I want to also thank STG for sponsoring us tonight. STG sponsors us all the time. I am no longer a full-time employee with STG, but I do still part-time stuff for them. But STG is a great company. We have Jess in the back. If anybody's looking for a job, talk to Jess. She's a wonderful recruiter. So we know that she's a wonderful recruiter because she shows up to these. So that's one of the things that makes her wonderful. And I still have a minute, so I'll just stand here in silence for a minute. No, just kidding. So the next thing I like to do is lightning talk. So do we have anybody here that has something that they want to present to the group? It could be just 2 minutes, 1 minute, 5 minutes, whatever. Is there something that you've learned recently or that you found interesting that you want to bring up with the group? No? All right. Well, now we have to sit here for a long time to get to the 11. Just kidding. All right, so we'll go ahead and move on. When you come to these things, if you do have something that you found interesting, please feel free to bring them up. It's a good opportunity to get up in front of a couple people, not a lot. But, so I do have a lightning talk, but since I'm the main presenter, I call mine a tech tip of the day. So I'm going to talk a little bit about something that I found that I thought was pretty cool. How many here uses Bicep? Anybody? Just one of you? Who knows what Bicep is? Okay, it's not your ARM, although it's related to ARM. Bicep is the language that you use to do infrastructure as code in Azure. So you can build ARM templates, which is Azure Resource Manager. So ARM templates, they made a new language called Bicep, kind of sticking with the theme there. So think of it kind of like Terraform. So Terraform does infrastructure as code. Terraform is more cross-platform. Bicep is specific to Azure. And a lot of times one of the things that you want to do is you want to take a resource that you have already created in Azure and create a Bicep template for that. Now, if you go into the portal, you can export a template, but the problem with that is that it only exports into ARM right now. So if we go in here, and let's go in and look at, I don't know, let's go and look at this database, for instance. If we want to generate a template of this so that we can create it outside or as infrastructure as code, we can go down to this export template, and you'll see here that it creates an ARM template. ARM templates are kind of the older way in Azure to do infrastructure as code. They're a little bit harder to read. They're not very user-friendly. And so Microsoft came out with Bicep. And what Bicep does is it's much easier to write. It's almost like regular JSON. It's much easier to read and much easier to work with. And when you push Bicep up into Azure to have it generate the resources, it actually creates an ARM template for you and then applies the ARM template using Azure Resource Manager. So this is what an ARM template looks like, okay? Bicep is a lot easier. It's a lot more fun to work with. And so I was always wondering, how can we get Bicep generated for us? And there's a couple ways to do it, but I found one the other day that I thought was kind of interesting. So let's take a look at this. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to get the resource ID from the properties blade. Okay, so I'll bring this back. So as you can see, every resource in Azure has a resource ID. It's a great big long ID that Azure creates when you build that resource. So the way that you get that is you go into the properties. So every resource in Azure will have this properties blade. You'll go into properties and you'll scroll down here until you find the resource ID. So it's this one on the bottom here. So I'm going to take it, I'm going to copy that. And then what you can do is you can go into VS Code, and I'm having a hard time finding my mouse between these monitors. So, all right, we'll come into VS Code, and we'll create a new Bicep file. So we're just going to create one called database.bicep, since it's a database that we're going to be doing. And we're just going to stick it right here. Then what you'll do is you'll go ahead and you'll come up to the control pane, and you'll search for Bicep. Did I type that right? It's hard to see. Okay, Bicep. Whoops, hold on. You'll search for Bicep, insert resource, and then you just paste that resource ID right here into Visual Studio Code, and you hit enter, and then you wait for a few seconds. And I swear I did this just before this meeting.
So is it connecting into Azure?
Yeah, yep. So it connects up to Azure, and then it will.
Nope, it disappeared. It said a common exception.
Let me try that again. Maybe I accidentally pasted it twice or something. Let's try this. This little portable screen is 4K. Man, it makes everything tiny. Okay, there we go. So I must have pasted it twice. So that's all you do. And now this is the Bicep template for that resource. And let's see. Yeah, so anyway, it's a really cool way to generate Bicep files. Now, you're probably going to want to take and modify this and parameterize it and stuff before you put it into your CI/CD pipelines. But this gives you a really good base on what you need to do for your resources. And a lot of times when you're building out your Bicep templates, you may be like, well, I don't know how to specify the basic tier. How do I do that? Well, if you generate it this way, it'll tell you exactly the format you need to specify the basic tier. So this is a basic with 5 DTUs in there. So any questions on that?
Maybe you said this and I missed it. Is this an extension or is it just built into the
It's part of the Bicep extension that you have to install with Visual Studio Code. Yeah, that's a good question. So if we come into here, you can see that we've got, there's a Bicep extension in here somewhere right here. This Bicep extension, you do need that to make this work.
So can you do that in Visual Studio as well? Or?
It's just VS Code, yeah. As far as I know. I mean, I use VS Code for anything that's not .NET related, right? So Bicep, JavaScript, TypeScript, all that stuff I use VS Code for. So I haven't tried this in Visual Studio, but as far as I know, it doesn't work there.
Do you have a shortcut that executes it, or does it get executed?
The bicep file when I go to, yeah,
Can you just set it up in the CLI command?
you can. Yep, you can deploy bicep files from the CLI. The ideal way to do it though is in a pipeline. That's the way I almost always do it, but you can definitely deploy them through the CLI if you want to.
That's something that's nice, just like testing it first, you just,
Yeah, and so if you ever use .NET Aspire, have you heard of .NET Aspire? Yeah, so it's pretty new, and it's a new paradigm of building your applications where you inject .NET Aspire into your middleware, and then you can do all kinds of things like linking up your services, so it helps with service discovery and all that kind of stuff. And if you set all that up in code, then you can go to the command line and do an AZD up command, and it will deploy everything into Azure automatically for you. That's all, just with an AZD up command. It's really cool. We're gonna, I think next month we're gonna have a .NET Aspire.
I wasn't planning on doing Aspire.
What were you planning on doing?
I need to talk to you.
Okay, so we'll have to
I'm
chat.
gonna change what I was planning.
Okay, so we'll chat. But if you're interested in .NET Aspire, I would definitely look at that. That's kind of the way that Microsoft is moving for cloud deployments, at least into Azure. And I've been researching .NET Aspire to go into AWS, and it'll work there as well. So .NET Aspire is just a fantastic way to make sure that you're building your cloud applications correctly, and it makes things a lot easier for microservice service discovery. It'll set up databases for you and automatically inject your databases into your services. You can even include React front ends into .NET Aspire, and it will wire everything up for those as well. It's really slick, so something to look into. All right. Any other questions?
Sorry, one more.
Yeah, sure.
Usually I want to set the database, I have to go to like the manage identities and configure groups and everything. Can you do that in the bicep file too?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. So when I set up my pipeline and I set up my infrastructure as code, I make sure to set up all of that stuff. Because what you want to be able to do is not just deploy to production and not even just deploy to dev. You want to be able to say, you know what, I want to spin up a quick environment so that I can test something in the cloud as if it were real, and then just tear that thing down. So what you do is you set up your bicep to create everything you need in its own resource group, including managed identities, including the permissions, including all of that stuff. And then when you're done testing your stuff, you can just delete the resource group and tear it all back down again. So yeah, bicep is definitely, if you're focused on Azure and you know you're going to be in Azure, bicep is a great way to go. If you need to do cross-platform like AWS, GCP, any of those other ones, you may want to look at Terraform instead of bicep. But anything else? Okay, awesome. Okay, good. I hit all the steps. That's awesome. All right, so let's talk a little bit about databases. Now, there's a couple of different types of databases. I mean, there's really two types of databases in, I know I've got three here, but there's actually two types. Does anybody know what the two types are? So we have relational and we have NoSQL, right? So NoSQL, I don't know if anybody knows exactly what it stands for, but I've always heard it's a not only SQL, or what else have I heard? Yeah, anyway, it's not only SQL, let's just say that. So NoSQL databases are becoming more popular these days, but there's still a lot of relational databases in Azure. In fact, there's more relational databases than there are NoSQL databases in Azure. So first we'll talk a little bit about some of the relational databases, and they're all SQL based, and so we'll talk about them in that vein. So our SQL databases. The biggest one in Azure is going to be Azure SQL, right? So Azure SQL is 95% compatible with your on-prem SQL servers. There are a couple of things that Azure SQL is missing. So if you need things like a job, SQL agent to schedule jobs, or if you need linked servers and cross-server queries, those kinds of things won't work in Azure SQL. But if you're looking to migrate on-prem SQL Server up into Azure, there's a really great tool called the Azure Data Migration Tool, Data Migration Advisor, that you can point at your database, and then it'll run through and it'll tell you if there's anything that is going to be a problem if you move it up to Azure SQL. So you might be asking yourself, well, why would I care? Why do I want to go to Azure SQL if it's not 100% compatible? Well, first of all, the things that it doesn't support are probably things that you don't really need anyway, unless you already have them in a legacy system. If you're creating a new database and a new application, those things that Azure SQL is missing can be done in different ways in the cloud, right? So Azure SQL also supports automatic scaling, backups, and high availability. So with Azure SQL, it's got a couple of cool things where, in fact, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the stuff that it has in here. Yes, it's Microsoft SQL Server 95% of the way. So it's completely compatible with SQL Server Management Studio or Azure Data Studio. It's completely compatible with Entity Framework. So it's just as if you're using SQL Server, because it is SQL Server. It's just missing a couple of those features that you probably don't really need anyway. Okay. But this right here is an Azure SQL. And in fact, when you create an Azure SQL database, you actually have to create a server first in Azure, and then you create a database under the server. And you can have as many databases as you want in the server, so it looks almost exactly like on-prem SQL. And in fact, if you bring it up in SQL Server Management Studio, it looks exactly the same. There's just a couple things missing. But again, one of the nice things about pretty much any cloud database, really, but Azure SQL for sure, is the ability to do scaling, right? So right now I have this at 5 DTUs here. I could come up here and I could say, I have a business critical need. I need to have 128 vCores, and this thing is going to scale up to 4 terabytes, and that's going to cost me $29,000 a month, almost $30,000 a month. And if I click apply, it takes a few minutes, but it will crank my database up to that level and start charging me the second it does. So be very careful with this, because it's really easy to make a mistake with this. So a guy that I used to work with, I won't mention his name because he might be embarrassed. He might be watching the YouTube. I don't know. He came into here and he thought, okay, let me see, what should I pick? Oh, general purpose, most budget friendly. Oh yeah, I'll do that. That sounds really good. Well, the cheapest one of that is 300. Well, let's see. No, let's take this back down. So the cheapest option of that is $222 a month. I think this is really disingenuous of Microsoft to put that in there. It is by far not the most budget friendly. So he picked that, and it was a whole thing. But if you're in production, then you probably do need at least this level. But one of the cool things here is the serverless option. You can come into serverless, and you can give it a max vCore and a min vCore. So let's say you have a database that gets really busy in the afternoon, but the rest of the day it just kind of sits there almost idle. Okay, or maybe it has days that it's really busy, or parts of the year where it's really busy, and you don't want to put it too low to save money, because what could happen is it doesn't have enough power to deal with your busy times. And so you can make this serverless, and by doing it serverless, you could crank this up to say 12 cores. Okay, I know that when I'm super busy, I need at least 12 cores. Other than that, I only need 1.5 cores, so I don't need that much. And then what will happen is when your database starts getting really busy, it will automatically scale itself up to use those cores. Obviously, you're going to get charged for that while it's at that level, but once the database gets less busy, it's going to scale itself back down again. And the other nice thing about this is this has this auto pause, and so you can say, so in this case it's a 1 hour auto pause, and what that's saying is, if I don't get any traffic on that database for an hour, scale it to 0, turn it off, and then you don't get charged anything for the database while it's scaled to 0. So this could be a really cost-effective way to have a high-powered database when you need it, and then not have a high-powered database when you don't.
It takes about 30 seconds.
Now,
for this to spin back up.
the first time somebody comes to it after it's been scaled down, it does have to scale back up, right? It goes cold.
We use that all the time with our production database.
Good, good, yeah.
But I say the first hit to the database, it takes a bit for it to spin up.
Yeah, it does. I mean, and that makes sense, right? If you have a VM or containers or anything that goes cold, it has to spin up. This is the same way. But you could take it down to 1.5 cores and just let it sit there and chug along if that's good enough for what you need. And you can see here that this one doesn't give us a price because, again, it's a variable price throughout the day, right? So this costs $0.000145 per vCore second. So what that means is if we have 12 vCores, then it's going to cost, let's see if we can figure this out. What is it? $0.000145. And then we want to do that times 12. So that's going to cost us 0.000. Oh wait, too many zeros. Okay, 1, 2, 3, and then 145, right? Times 12. So that's going to cost us $0.00174 per second that thing's running. And how many seconds are in a day? Does anybody know right off the top of their head? 86,400. So that's $150 per day to run that database at 12 cores. Now that's expensive, right? Or sounds expensive. But the reality is if you need that kind of power, hopefully it's because you're getting a lot of customers, you're making lots of money, and so that kind of money isn't that big a deal. But when you're not getting a lot of customers and making lots of money, it'll scale back down and it'll even go to zero, which then is free. If it's pegged out to the full 12 cores, yep.
Okay,
So it could be anywhere in between there, right? Yeah. Probably be less than that. Yep, yep. And you know that's a good point. If you have it at 12 vCores and you're constantly pegging that database at 100%, you might actually want to consider stretching it out. And the same thing with this, if you have this on serverless, and let's say you have it at 12 vCores, and it's always used really heavily, 24/7, all day long, every day, it's really consistent, then this is not a good option. What you want to do in that case is you want to go to provision. And provision means you pick how many vCores it's going to need, and that's what it stays at all the time. Okay, and that's a little bit more cost-effective typically, because it doesn't have to scale it up and down. Okay. Okay, so now this is the vCore method, right? So there's two different ways to specify database capacity in Azure, for Azure SQL. You have the vCore method, which is what this is, and then you have the DTU method, okay? So if we drop this down here, you'll see that we have this DTU-based purchasing model. If we pick basic here, look how much a basic database costs, $4.90 a month, okay? This is by far the cheapest way to do SQL Server, unless you just barely use the serverless option. If you barely use the serverless option, it could be maybe, but probably not. So this is the cheapest way to do it, but DTUs are a little bit weird. It stands for Database Transaction Unit, okay? And what that means is that Microsoft has determined an amount of CPU, I/O, storage, well not storage because you pick storage separate, but DTU and I/O and network and all the stuff that a database needs, and packaged it into this DTU. I don't know exactly what a DTU is, but you pick how many DTUs you want. And the more DTUs, the more powerful database you have, right? So if you pick basic, you only get one option, you get 5. You get 5 DTUs and that's it. You can crank this guy up pretty high too. So we can come here and we can crank this up to 4,000 DTUs, and you can see that it can get pretty expensive as well. So you just kind of got to decide which way you want to go. I typically go the vCore route if I'm going to be doing high production stuff, but you kind of just got to decide how you want to do that. Okay. And I am not going to click OK on any of that. I'm just going to go back to this.
We were using DTU, and then went back to the core stuff. At night, we've got a sort machine. That was one of the things when we started the sort machine, they didn't think there'd be enough latency between our facility and up into the Azure cloud for the database to know where, to put these packages in the containers.
Mm-hmm.
But we went to the virtual or the off the DTU, and we're able to have that sort machine function just fine.
Yeah. And that's the nice thing too, is that you can come into there and you could, let's say that that you've got a week where you're going to be super busy, and you don't want to do serverless because for whatever reason you don't want to. But let's say you're on basic, you could just come into here and do business critical, and boom, click OK, and you're done, right? So you can swap these back and forth as much as you want. You can change the scale, whatever you want to do, whenever you want. It's just I heard. I think it was Scott Guthrie. I think it was Scott Guthrie. He works for Microsoft. He said that we've taken spending money on IT down to being a mouse click. And it literally is. I mean, I can come in here and I could say $30,000 a month. Okay, boom, and you're spending $30,000 a month. Now, there are ways in Azure that you can kind of limit that, right? Because you don't want your developers to go in there and be creating all kinds of crap that you don't know about. So there's things called Azure policy that you can use to go and limit what they can do. Obviously, there's roles that you can put around that kind of stuff. So that's out of scope of this discussion.
Going along with that, is there a way to just hard cap, like for whatever my Azure subscription is, no matter what, like hell or high water, I will never spend more than like $2,000 a month?
Yep, you can set a budget.
Because I know we set a bunch of alerts where we get notifications that like, hey, you've gone over 500 this month, but
okay, if you're on a pay-as-you-go plan. Now, if you have a Microsoft Enterprise Services Agreement, I don't know if you could do this or not, but if you're on a pay-as-you-go, you can set a budget and set that budget to be a hard limit. And then once you hit that, it will turn everything off. Now, once your month is up and it cycles over to the next pay period, everything will come back up again. But for that, week and a half, 2 weeks, whatever it is, it cuts you off. So I've got an MSDN subscription, which I get $150 a month in Azure credits with my MSDN subscription. That's a hard budget. So when I hit that $150, I have no Azure for the rest of the month. So you got to be careful with that. Now, with your pay-as-you-go, if that happens and you decide, oh crap, we have got to get back up, you can just go in there and turn off the budget, right? But yes, you can definitely do that with budgets and make them a hard cap.
what was it? MSDN?
Yeah. I think it's called Visual Studio subscription now, actually. Visual Studio Enterprise. Yeah.
You'll see the MSDN label if you dig through stuff.
Yeah.
But it's a Visual Studio subscription.
Back when I was a little bit younger, it was the MSDN subscription, the Microsoft Developer Network, and they would. So with that subscription, you get software. So like you get licenses for Windows and licenses for Office and licenses for the server software and all that kind of stuff. And when I was younger, before the internet was really a thing, they used to send me DVDs every month, and sometimes I would get a stack of DVDs like this with all the MSDN stuff on it. And I went through a couple years ago and got rid of them all. I had boxes of these DVDs that I was just throwing away. But
the last disc I got was for Windows Vista, and I found it just a few weeks ago while I was cleaning out my office.
you're like, sweet, I can install Windows Vista
Even
again.
had the license key on the back of the envelope. I'm like, oh, sweet.
Yeah. Those are the good old days. But yeah, they don't do that now. Everything's downloadable now. Any other questions on Azure SQL? I mean, there's a lot more stuff we could talk about. And we'll, as we go along, we're going to do more deep dives into each of these. But, given the fact that there's so many that we want to get through today, I didn't want to focus too much on them. So as we go through them, if there are any questions you have, I'm happy to answer them. But we're just going to kind of give some cursory.
One last question on that.
Sure.
Back to the storage redundancy.
Mhm.
Do you have any recommendations for like a raw database?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on what you want to do. So locally redundant backup. So what that does is so Azure SQL will automatically back up, right? It'll do point in time backup. So you can actually go and back up from half an hour ago, right? Or restore from like half an hour ago. Locally redundant backup, what that does is that backs up in the local data center, okay? So with Azure, you've got data centers scattered all over the world, right? And inside of those data centers, so they're called regions. Well, let's call them regions. So there's regions all over the world. Inside those regions, there are multiple data centers in a region. So let's say you have region US West 1, okay? Inside of that region, which is like probably in Chicago or something, there are 2 to 3 data centers that are separated by X number of miles. I don't know what it is. I haven't been able to find out. I don't know if they ever advertise that. But there's these three data centers in that region. They each have their own power, each have their own network, and are completely isolated from the others, except they do have a connection to each other, right? So locally redundant storage stores everything into the local data center that your database is in. So if that data center goes down, let's say a missile hits the data center, all your data is gone, right? The backup is there as well. You can have zone redundant backup storage, and then that will save it into the availability zone and utilize the other data centers inside of that region. And so if one data center gets hit, your data is still safe in another data center. Geo-redundant backup storage is backing up to another region. So you might be in East US, it's going to back up in West US. And you can set up the geo-redundant to back up multiple places around the world if you want. In fact, with Azure SQL and with a lot of these, you can set up geo-replication as well. And you can have multiple active databases that stay synced all the time, which is a really good idea for a lot of reasons that we'll talk about in another presentation. So there's the different ways of doing backup. So it just depends on how much you want to spend and how much so in databases, there's this concept of RTO and RPO, right? Recovery time objective, recovery point objective. And as you're deciding how you want to do your database and how you want to back it up and how you want to do your geo-replication, stuff like that, you have to think about that. So recovery time objective, how long is your organization willing to be down? So if your database goes down, how long is your organization willing to be down? Most organizations will say 0. I want 0 downtime, right? That's unrealistic. And so you have to decide what's the realistic number for the recovery time objective in my organization. And then the recovery point objective, how much data am I willing to lose if there's a problem? Again, every organization is going to say, I don't want to lose any data ever, no matter what. That's not realistic. You have to plan around recovery point objective. Now, you can get that really, really high or really, really, really low. But the lower you get that, the more it's going to cost, right? You can have a database with a locally redundant backup storage that has a little higher RTO or RPO than normal, but it's going to be a lot cheaper. Once you start replicating it, backing it up across geo areas, then it's going to start getting more expensive. So that's something that the organization has to decide. Okay, anything else? Okay. Well, let's move on to the next one. Let's see if I miss any points here. Supports blah, blah, blah. Okay. Yeah, so in Azure SQL, like I said, as far as your code is concerned, it's just SQL Server. It has a connection string just like SQL Server. It looks exactly like SQL Server. Okay. Now, there's another way to do SQL Server in Azure as well. So Azure SQL is kind of the cloud native way to do it. There are a couple of other ways to do it as well. If you need more compatibility with on-prem SQL, then you can do a SQL managed instance, or you can even do a hybrid database, or if you absolutely have to, you can put SQL Server in a VM up in Azure. Unless it's an absolute requirement, I always recommend against putting SQL Server into a VM because you're losing a lot of the cloud capabilities by doing that, right? Now, VMs can scale, VMs can do all kinds of things, but there are much better ways to do databases in the cloud than in a VM. So we have SQL Managed Instance. It's a managed instance of SQL, so you don't have a VM, but you have some more compatibility with SQL Server than you do with Azure SQL. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in another thing. So if you're doing a lift and shift and your Azure data migration agent tells you, well, there's these problems that make it so you can't go to Azure SQL and you can't mitigate those problems by fixing them, then SQL Managed Instance is a good way to go. And then you can do hybrid solutions. So there's this technology called Azure Arc that lets you run on-prem servers but manage them from within Azure. And so if you have an on-prem SQL server, but you want to manage it in Azure, including RBAC roles and backups and all that kind of stuff, you can tie that SQL server to Azure through Azure Arc, and then you have a hybrid solution there. So,
quick comment on the lift and shift stuff.
Yeah.
There's in the Microsoft Applied Skills training material, there's an applied skill you can go out and earn on migrating your SQL, local SQL databases to Azure. And they actually go through how to use all the different tools and kind of do the audit and look at
Awesome.
your databases and check to see, is your database compatible? Are there things you need to resolve before you can go move it to Azure? Which is, anyway, it's some pretty cool training material. It's all hands-on.
Very cool.
You can try it out for free.
Yeah, I mean, if you're interested in hands-on learning of a lot of Microsoft stuff, those applied skills certificates or badges or whatever they call them,
They're more like a badge.
yeah, they're amazing. They are really cool and they're all free. You can go take these and get certified. And they have a lot of Azure stuff, a lot of .NET stuff up there, and they're just a really good thing to do. So, any questions on this? Okay. Azure Database for Postgres. So there is a managed Azure version of Postgres, and it's just like your on-prem Postgres. There's two ways. I think they're sunsetting single server, so single server is going away. Flexible server is the way they're doing it now, but it's essentially just Postgres in the cloud, and it has all the stuff that Postgres has in there as well. So if you need Postgres, then you can use Azure Postgres. And it, very similar to Azure SQL, your code doesn't really know the difference. As far as your code is concerned, it is Postgres. It costs a little bit more, at least on the cheaper end, than Azure SQL. So I've got a Azure Postgres server up there, and I have it on the very cheapest thing I can get, and I think it's costing about $30 a month or so. So you can get an Azure SQL for $5 a month. Postgres, the cheapest I've been able to get it down to is I think about $25, $30 a month. But if you need Postgres, it's a really good solution, and Postgres is becoming more and more popular all the time. We also have MySQL. So MySQL is one of the most popular databases in the world, right? Several years ago, if you wanted to run MySQL in Azure, you had to do it in a VM. But now they have a fully managed MySQL database up in Azure. And again, it looks just like MySQL from your code. And the next one is MariaDB. Has anybody ever used MariaDB? Yeah. It's essentially MySQL. I think what happened was, and I may be wrong, so don't write any of this down, but I think MySQL was purchased by Oracle. That made some people upset, so they forked MySQL, created MariaDB. So MariaDB is almost identical to MySQL, at least at that fork point. Now they're diverging a little bit, but it's very similar to MySQL.
I think the original team that made MySQL left.
And that forked off MariaDB.
Yeah.
I think so too. I've used MariaDB a little bit. It's good. I mean, so if you need that, that's that option. So there's a lot of options for SQL databases with Azure. So we've got SQL Server. Obviously, SQL Server is probably the favorite child in Azure. Why? Because it's a Microsoft product, right? And Azure is a Microsoft product. Microsoft, though, is doing amazing stuff with embracing other tools and other technologies. And so that's why they got Postgres, MySQL, MariaDB, all these different databases to try to make sure that they can offer whatever your solution needs up in Azure. Okay, so non-relational. So there are a lot of different non-relational databases in Azure as well. Well, let me take that back. There's two non-relational databases in Azure, not a lot. The first one is Azure Cosmos DB. And when Cosmos first came out, it was really interesting because they called it their planet scale database. And what that means is that Cosmos can be deployed to data centers all over the world with millisecond latency across the entire platform. And so when you go to write something, it automatically writes that to every database on the entire planet that you have an instance installed to. So it's very, very global, very distributed, incredibly high performance, and you pay for that as well, right? Cosmos is not cheap, but if you need something like that, then Cosmos is a really good way to go. And Cosmos supports several different APIs. So there's a SQL API, which is the default for Cosmos. So if you use Cosmos with the SQL API, then you can actually do SQL queries against it, just like you would a regular SQL database. There's also a MongoDB API, Cassandra. Yes, it does. Yep. Yep.
It didn't used to. They added it later.
And now they've got a Cosmos DB emulator that you can run on your computer, on your local machine, so you don't even have to hit the actual Cosmos database in the backend. So if you want to learn how to use Cosmos, then you can just do that. And you don't have to pay for anything. Cosmos is super powerful and just really, really cool. So we'll talk more about Cosmos at another time. Any questions about Cosmos? Other than it's a cool name, I guess. And then the other NoSQL is Azure Table Storage. So in Azure you have storage accounts, right? And you can throw all kinds of stuff into storage accounts. So you can just store files, you can store blobs, you can actually serve static websites from a storage account. There's all kinds of things you can do in storage account, and Azure Table Storage is one of those things. And it's just a key value store for semi-structured data. So it's just a key, and then you send in a value, whether that be a JSON object, whether it be just a string, whatever that is, it's a key value store. And it's super low cost, so it's really cheap, and it's pretty high performance, but it's missing a lot of the things that you might need in a really enterprise-grade NoSQL database. But it's a really good way to get into it and store some stuff in a NoSQL way. And obviously, there's like everything in Azure, there's REST APIs for it. There are .NET SDKs, Java SDKs. I think there's even JavaScript SDKs. And then you can use Azure Storage Explorer. So if you haven't used Azure Storage Explorer, that's a tool that allows you to just go in and see everything that you have in your storage accounts. All right. Any questions on that? So Redis is its own thing. There's an Azure Redis as well. I mean, you could probably use this for caching if you wanted to, but if you're going to do heavy caching, Azure Redis would be a better way to go for that. Yeah. In fact, I think, do I have a? Oh yeah, look at that. The next slide is Azure Redis. So Azure Redis is really, really fast, very high performance, very scalable. It's just a managed instance of Redis. And in .NET, if you want to use it, it's just the stack exchange.redis NuGet package. You just throw that in there. And this is another thing that .NET Aspire really helps with, is you can just include Redis in your middleware, and then you just inject that into anything that needs that, and it will automatically know the connection string, where to get to it, how to use it, and all that stuff. It's really cool. So Redis is good for caching. It has the pub/sub messaging streams. If you want to use it for that, you can. There are a lot of other ways to do messaging streams in Azure than Redis, but if you want to do that, you can. Redis also integrates with your Azure networking. So some resources in Azure don't let you add it into a VNet, but Azure Redis will allow you to do that, which gives it, the ability to do firewalls and all kinds of stuff like that. So yeah, if you're familiar with Redis, Azure Redis is a great way to use that. All right, and Azure Synapse Analytics. This isn't really a database per se, but it's a way to get your data analyze it, and put it into a data warehouse. I don't have a lot of experience with Synapse Analytics, but you can set up streams so that it can get your data, put it otherwhere. It supports massive parallel processing, so you can pump a lot of data through Synapse Analytics. And it integrates with Power BI, Data Factory, AI, all that kind of stuff. And we will do a presentation on Synapse one of these days, but I have to learn it first, so it might be a while. Okay, so how do you know which database to choose, right? That's always a question that people come up with. And there's no answer to that, right? What's the most popular answer in anything development related? It depends, right? What database do I use? Well, it depends, right? There's a lot of things you got to think about. You know, how much scalability do you need? How much performance do you need? Do you want relational? Do you want NoSQL? You know, how much money are you willing to spend? You know, where do you want your backups? How do you want your backups done? Do you want it in the cloud or do you want it on-prem, right? Now here we're obviously talking about all cloud databases, but maybe you want it on-prem. There's a lot of people that are still on-prem. How are you going to do your data warehousing? So you may have your transactional database, but then you want to have a data warehouse too. They don't have to necessarily be the same thing, right? So there's a new tool in Azure called Microsoft Fabric that is designed to take all of your data and you know, consolidate it into a single place. I think that's what you were going to talk about actually, but you changed your mind. Okay, all right. And Fabric is really, really cool, but it's not cheap either. I mean, even to play with, you have to set up, I can't remember what they call it. It's been a while since I've looked at Fabric.
So they have a
Like,
trial, you can set up a 30-day trial and once you run it, like play around with it.
yeah.
And then
Yeah.
you have to set up a data warehouse.
Yeah, you have to, there's a thing called like a catalog or something. I can't remember what they call it. But you have to set up this resource, and it's not cheap. It was expensive, and so I'm like, yeah, I'm not gonna do that. But then you can send all your data into there. You can get it out of there. It's really pretty amazing. So if you need a huge data warehousing solution, Microsoft Fabric is a good way to go. In fact, if we go look at, let's go take a quick peek at our database. If we go over up to Overview, you'll see right up here at the very top, mirror database in Microsoft Fabric. Easily replicate your blah, 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 blah. So it's like you can automatically tie your databases into Fabric and then they'll be available in there. And this is really nice because it uses a industry standard format for storing your data that APIs all over the world already understand. So you can point all of this stuff at your Fabric instance, and then you can grab data out for whatever you want outside of Azure as well, right? And it integrates in with Azure Data Factory, Azure Synapse Analytics, and I'm forgetting the other one. Anyway, Microsoft Fabric looks really cool, and if we come here, we could sit here and just read this together, but that would be lame. So
There's an applied skill of learning how to use.
yes, there is. Yep. Have you? Good. How you liking it? It's hard. Now, I mean, as we know, right, there's different disciplines inside of our industry, right? You've got your developers, you've got your architects, you've got your data guys, and they're probably the ones that are going to be playing with Fabric. They're excited about it. I mean, I do data, but it's not my passion, and so I don't know how much I'm going to get into Fabric. But it's really cool if that's something that your company needs. I think the important thing is knowing what's available. Nobody can be an expert on everything, but you can at least know what's available. So Fabric is something that's available if that's something that your organization needs. Okay. Any other questions? That's all I got for slides. Any other questions?